And finally, what I'd like to do is point out that over the years, several people have worried a little bit about whether or not Simmelian ties is just a surrogate for strong ties. And that's a reasonable argument. And the reason it's reasonable, frankly, is because what we found is that lots of times strong ties, Simmelian ties, are a lot stronger, and we certainly have found that they're so there's good reason to think that they might be, um, confounded. So the real question is, are Simmelian ties nothing more than just stronger ties, or are they different? We have, as a matter of fact, good reasons to think that they would be confounded. And one is because Mark Granovetter, when he originally proposed a whole theory of weak ties and their value, is he said strong ties tend to form triangles, tend to be form groups, and that what the weak ties do is help you bridge across the divides between those groups. And so therefore, strong ties, the whole point of strong ties is that they tend to be imploded in these self-contained groups, which means that basically they are providing redundant information, and weak ties allow you to bridge across that divide. One of the problems in trying to decide whether or not strong ties and Simmelian ties are really the same thing is that there have been lots of ways of measuring strong ties over the years. Mark, in his original piece, gave some hints as to how strong ties might be different than weak ties, but he never really defined them as being characterized by any particular traits. He did say they tended to be mutual, they tended to be more frequent, they tended to have better affect and things like that. But there was no definition. These were just characteristics that were likely to be found in stronger ties. And over the years, different people have used different aspects to measure strong ties as opposed to weak ties. Sometimes they use reciprocity as a measure, an indication of a strong tie, as a weak tie would be an asymmetric tie. Sometimes there's a scale, it depends how frequently you interact, or how strongly you interact with this person, or how strongly you relate to this person, or whatever. And then you take a mean, and below the mean is a weak tie, and above the mean is a strong tie, or something like that. And occasionally, even like Brian Utzi's work, building on Mark Granovetter's, even uses the word embeddedness. That is, that strong ties are those that are embedded in some community structure, and which certainly has a flavor of being a Simmelian tie embedded in a triple. That's been one of the problems of trying to separate out Simmelian ties from stronger ties, both empirically and theoretically. But let me suggest that one way of separating them out is to draw on Philos theory for strong ties. Philos theory is a very kind of conditional statement of when a strong tie exists, because it's a particular kind of strong tie. And it argues that strong ties require three conditions. One, frequent interaction. There's no such thing as a Philos theory, a Philos tie that is not doesn't involve frequently interacting with somebody. Second is you got to have positive affect, and the reason for that is what that becomes the glue for making a relationship really work and motivating both people to continue it and to build on it. And the third is that there's got to be time. There's no such thing as instant Philos relationships, the instant strong ties by this by this model, that what you need to do is have time where people get to observe each other in different situations, and by doing so, you can develop a good sense of how they will behave under lots of situations. And all three of these things combine to produce trust, and trust is something that's critical to the foundations of organizations and social systems in general. So the three of these are critical in defining what a philos tie is, and they are, in fact, a way of talking about strong ties in a very precise, theoretically defined way. So, so the question is that we're going to pursue here is, and they're going to use to look at the difference between philos and or strong ties and Simmelian ties, is we're going to ask the question, is stress a socially induced disease or condition? This is a question that was proposed by Shihan Lee, one of our PhD students, and Ninka and I have been working with Shihan, not only collecting the data, but looking at a lot of questions that have come out of these data. She's looking at because Ninka's involved especially, some very sophisticated RCN models. But what I'm going to do is steal a slice of these data to make a slightly different point than the one that Shihan originally proposed when she collected these data. So we have data from 250 students in a professional master's program. They're all adults, you know, they've come back from graduate school to get their master's degree. 250 students who are between the ages of 25 and 35. And they come and get a degree that helps them specialize in lots of different programs. Some of them are specializing in MIS. Some of them are specializing in public policy. Some of them are specializing in sort of economic and econometric modeling. Some of them are specializing in data analytics. All different programs. Some of which are tougher than others, so that in fact they tend to induce more stress. However, all the students are required to take a set of Common Core classes during their first semester, and the courses are divided up into half-semester courses. They're 7 weeks long. They're called minis, and the particularly sensitive stress points for these students, especially during their first year, are right at the beginning when they just show up and there's a lot of uncertainty. They don't know what's going on. They don't know anybody. And then at the end of the first set of classes, which happens 7 weeks later, when they get their first set of projects due and finals that they have to take. And then again, another 7 weeks after that, when their second set of classes is due, and they're confronting some more finals and so on. So we collected data over 3 points in time. That first week when they first arrive, that last week of the first mini when they're facing finals, and the last week of the second mini when they're also facing finals. They take some classes in common. We have measures of how tough the classes are and how much work they are and so on. We have measures of their personality, we have measures of other kinds of things that are likely to lead to stress or help to ameliorate stress. And in addition, we have pictures of their networks over all 3 time points. By the way, some of actually Shihan had collected some more, but I'm only going to talk about the first 3 time points here because the data get thin after the first 3 time points. But so we have network data. We have their choice of who actually chose who as a friend among these 250 people during those 3 points in time, at time 1, time 2, and time 3. we have a measure of their stress level at each point in their time in these times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a very straightforward network autocorrelation question. I've got a measure here of stress. Y is a vector of stress values for each of the 250 students. Then I've got a whole bunch of covariates with the normal OLS predictors and weights on those. Those have to do with the classes they're taking, the program they're in, their personality, and all those other things that are likely to relate to stress, and some of them do in fact relate to stress, as we have noted. But what I'm particularly interested in is at time 3, when people have had experience, they've gotten to know each other, they have developed some ties, they've gotten around, and things have settled down. At time 3, at the end of, or in December, when they're facing their finals for the end of the full semester and their end of the second set of mini courses, when they're faced with that situation, is stress a function of all these various variables that we attribute to stress ordinarily, or is it a function of the network effect? This WY term, W is the network and Y is, again, the vector of stress, and what we multiply the W is normalized network effect, and what WY is essentially the average stress of all of your network ties, of your neighbors, of your friends. So WY is basically how much stress your friends exhibit or record. And then rho here is the parameter, just like beta. It just tells us the extent to which this term is having an effect, controlling for all the other covariates over here in the model. So rho is, the reason rho is separated out and it's not just thrown into the abyss, because y is also, that puts y on the right-hand side of the equation as well as the left, which means that OLS models won't work. The coefficients would not be consistent. And so you need to have an autocorrelation model to deal with that. Pat Dorian solved this problem some years ago. I'm going to use Pat's model to estimate that coefficient rho on what the effect is of my neighbor's stress on my stress in this model. Okay, so I'm going to do that at time 3. And the reason I'm picking time 3 here in a second, you'll see. Basically, what I'm doing is asking the question, do my neighbors, my friends, have an effect on my, or at least is there a correlation between my neighbor's stress and my own stress? Does that's, and which we would often infer some kind of, our neighbors are affecting our stress. It could be the other way around, but it is the other, both things happen. But I'm just looking at the correlation here. Is there some part of the variance in stress that we can associate with the stress of our neighbors? The question is, what do we mean by neighbors? What kind of network are we going to look at here? One kind of network is I get to choose who my neighbors are, and I throw that choice set, the neighbors I pick. So if I choose you as a neighbor, you are in fact a neighbor, and that gets thrown into the model. And we ask the question, okay, is rho significant? That is there a significant effect of that autocorrelation model? And the answer is no. The answer is no. That at time 3, what we find is that there's no effect on, if we use the choice, the raw data of who we choose to select on who our friends are, that there's no association between our friends' stress and our own stress in December. What happens if I only restrict those stronger friends who are reciprocated? That is, I choose somebody and they choose me. What about those reciprocated friends? Do they induce, or do they seem to predict how stressful I'm going to be? And the answer is no. Reciprocated friendships do not do any better than the raw friendship choices in terms of being associated with my own stress. Okay, now what I'm going to do is ask the Philos question, which I can do with these data, and that is, not only are these people friends of mine, but the history of their friendship. I can capture that because I have the friendships at time 1 and time 2 and time 3. And what I can do is restrict myself to Philos ties, which are defined by those that were there at time 1, time 2, and time 3. That is, there's a history of those ties that I can observe. And if those ties are preserved, those in fact become Philos ties because of that history. And those in fact will be strong ties. And let's see how well they predict, looking at the Philos ties, predict in terms of being predictive of whether of my stress in relation to the stress of my Philos neighbors, Philos friends. And the truth is, in neither the case of raw Philos data, that is people I choose time and time again, or reciprocated Philos data, do we find any significant predictor of my own stress. So my neighbor's stress on the Philos by those strong definition ties, which are pretty strong definition of a strong tie, they don't help us understand my own stress. Now, what happens if I look at Simmelian ties in time 3 only? That is, I'm just going to look at Simmelian ties at time 3. Well, it turns out that Simmelian ties at time 3, not paying any attention to time 1 and time 2, are highly and significantly predictive of my own stress at time 3. So my stress is correlated with how stressful my Simmelian ties are at time 3. And but what happens if I look at that over time? That is, I restrict myself to not only Simmelian ties, but people who were tied, and I only use the ties that were Philos ties. That is, they would be both Philos ties, strong ties preserved over time, and Simmelian ties. What happens if I look at how stressed they are? And it turns out I get about the same result. In other words, it's the same effect of whether or not I use Philos ties as defining my Simmelian. It's the Simmelianness of them and not the Philosness of them that are predicting are successfully predicting whether I'm going to be stressed. And just to finish this, I also looked at whether or not soul symmetric ties, those ties that are strong, both on a Philos dimension and a cross-sectional edge, just a time 3 dimension. And it turns out soul symmetric ties do not predict whether or not, it doesn't matter whether my soul symmetric friends are stressed or not in terms of predicting my own stress. So the Simmelian ties really seem to dominate, at least in this analysis. So this is one indication, some evidence that it seems that Simmelianness counts more than the strength of the ties in terms of actually predicting some phenomena in the network realm that we all work in. All right. So in summary, Simmelian ties are qualitatively different from other types of ties, and it's worth decomposing the network into those, because it's not just a question of looking at the strength of their ties. They are functionally different. They provide a cleaner, clearer, and more compelling understanding of the forces that govern a lot of the interactions and the consequences of those interactions that we find in order. And we find lots of examples of this. Simmelian ties are induced by groups. So theoretically, they're different than strong ties. They reflect the roles and norms and the common understanding and the cultural expectations that come from those groups that you don't get just by having a dyadic, even strong tie. And what that does is induces enforced cooperation and trust. In other words, Simmelian ties provide the core. They provide the backbone, the kind of underbelly, the real strong skeleton of what's going on, the structure within. And so that you can find out what's really holding the system together and what's really making it operate, rather than paying attention to all the noisy stuff that goes around along the edges. Okay. And that finishes my talk.